The cod industry, Mr. Speaker, in Western Newfoundland is in crisis.
There isn't any immediate crisis that I know of in that particular stock at the present time.
And I quote from the Minister's own report, the cod industry in Western Newfoundland is in a crisis. The fixed gear fishery in Western Newfoundland is at a point of no return if there is no strategy to rebuild the cod stocks in the near future. That report is 24 months old, and the rate of decline has continued over the last 24 months.
Because the honourable member rises in this House and shouts across the House doesn't make a situation a crisis.
For at least the next 2 years, much of Newfoundland will lose a way of life. It's a moratorium on fishing for northern cod, a ban that will affect about 20,000 people and gut the backbone of the Atlantic fishery.
This is Newfoundland. This is Labrador. Together, they make up the easternmost province of Canada, called Newfoundland and Labrador. In 1497, just 5 years after Christopher Columbus sailed the Atlantic, a man named John Cabot did the same but found himself in Newfoundland. There, he discovered some land that was neither new nor found, but perhaps more importantly, he found cod. And he found a lot of it. So much cod that people started settling Newfoundland just because of how easy it was to make a living catching cod. Just off the coast of Newfoundland to the southeast is an area known as the Grand Banks. This is part of the North American continental shelf where the ocean is still relatively shallow. The Grand Banks have historically been some of the richest fishing grounds in the world. Although the cod were most concentrated on Newfoundland's east coast, their reach in North America extended as far south as North Carolina and all the way up to Greenland in the north. There might not be another place in the world that owes its existence to fishing as much as Newfoundland does. For centuries, fleets of ships from Europe would make seasonal trips to Newfoundland to fish cod, which were seen as a common property resource by protein-hungry European nations since the 1500s. Eventually, the island became a permanent settlement to support the export of fish from the Northwest Atlantic to Europe. But besides the cod, there wasn't much else that made the island appealing for settlement. If you've ever visited Newfoundland, it's not hard to understand why the island is called The Rock. The soil in Newfoundland is not great for growing crops, which was a pretty big non-starter for Europeans looking to settle down in the New World. Not to mention the winters there, which are harsh at best and can be lethal at worst. There were many reasons to choose not to settle in Newfoundland, but there was one big reason to settle there, and that was the cod. There was high demand, high supply, and it could reliably provide a living wage for anyone willing to go out on a boat and get it. So, that's what almost everyone there did, and that's where the problem started. In the first 50 years of the 20th century, the population of Newfoundland nearly doubled. But during the same period of time, cod landings stayed mostly the same. If the fishery was going to continue to be a viable way to make a living, something was going to have to change. It was right around this time that new ideas in resource management were developing. It was thought that with adequate scientific understanding of how a resource like cod behaved, that outputs from those resources could be optimized with the right kind of management. Like min-maxing, but for catching fish. For a one-industry island like Newfoundland, the cod fishery had carried them through the past 4 centuries, and optimization of the fishery and its management was their way to continue prospering into the 20th century. Management of the fishery was broken up into 2 areas, domestic and international. When Newfoundland joined Canada in 1949, one of the conditions for the deal was that the management of the domestic Newfoundland fishery would fall under jurisdiction of the Federal Department of Fisheries and Oceans, or the DFO. A small price to pay for the benefits that came with being part of a united nation, or so it seemed. In 1949, territorial claims to the ocean extended 3 miles from a country's coast. This wasn't usually written in law, but it was a convention dating back to the 18th century that most countries agreed on. Within this 3-mile zone around Canada's ocean coastlines, the DFO were the ones in charge of the fishery. They decided who was allowed to catch fish and what equipment they were allowed to use. Outside of that 3-mile zone were international waters, the same international waters that had been treated as common property by European nations for centuries. In the 1940s, discussions were starting up about forming an international organization to manage ocean resources in the Northwest Atlantic's international waters. The US led the charge in 1949 to form ICNAF, the International Commission for the Northwest Atlantic Fisheries. The general idea was that individual countries would manage fisheries within their own ocean borders, and ICNAF would manage them on the international waters in the Northwest Atlantic. One of the first actions that the Commission took was to define its operating borders. That map looked something like this. In terms of cod, the most important zones in the ICNAF management area were 2J, 3K, and 3L. This is where nearly half of all the historic Northern Atlantic cod had been caught over the past 4 centuries. This area is usually referred to as 2J, 3KL. Within its defined operating area, ICNAF's mandate was the investigation, protection, and conservation of the fisheries, with the goal to make possible the maintenance of a maximum sustained catch from the ICNAF fisheries. So basically, to let member countries have their cake and eat it too. It's these conflicting objectives that are at the heart of the collapse of the Northern Atlantic cod, the desire to conserve the fish while simultaneously exploiting them to the highest extent possible. Finding that upper limit for what is the maximum sustained catch for a population is not a simple problem, but that didn't stop people from giving it a simple solution. In the 1930s, a model was proposed to maximize how many individuals could be taken from a population while keeping the population constant year over year. That amount taken is called the Maximum Sustainable Yield, or MSY. Catch less than the MSY, and the population will recover to the same level as before, no problem. Catch more than the MSY, and the population will recover a bit, but not as high as before. The MSY level is the Goldilocks zone. In theory, it lets you take as much as possible from a population without causing damage. The key words there being, in theory. It's a simple model with simple conclusions about how to manage it. Because of its simplicity, the maximum sustainable yield model was attractive for policymakers of the day. Developed countries were looking for scientifically backed ways of maximizing efficiency and output from their resources. This model became so popular that in 1949, the US mandated all national fisheries had to increase their quotas all the way up to the MSY. By 1955, they started advocating for this in international agreements as well. The argument was that anything below the MSY was a waste of a replenishing resource, so why shouldn't people be allowed to take the theoretical upper limit of what was there? Again, theoretical is the key word. The problem with the MSY model is the same thing that made it so attractive. It was simple. And with simplicity came assumptions that did not reflect reality. An MSY model focuses on a single species at a time, so it assumes that changes in the population have no effect on other species. Anyone who's ever looked at predator-prey dynamics knows that's a terrible assumption. In the example of cod, take a look at seals, who are natural predators of cod, and capelin, who are natural prey of cod. If the population of seals goes down, then there are fewer seals eating cod, so the number of cod will increase. If the capelin population decreases, there will be less capelin for the cod to eat, so the number of cod will decrease. So, if you're modeling cod but ignoring changes to the seal or capelin populations, you're gonna have a large difference between the population you expect and the population that actually exists. Another problem with the MSY model is that it ignores the age and therefore sexual maturity of the fish being caught. If in a given year you caught more old fish than you anticipated, your birth rate would drop the next year. It's these kind of dynamics that aren't easily captured by a simple model with many assumptions. But in the 1950s, the prevailing intent behind ocean management was to treat the ocean as a field and the fish as a crop, regardless of how complicated it was to model. Any assumptions made were just accepted, for a lack of a better way to achieve that management objective. So in the 1950s, just like the US, Canada and the DFO settled on maximum sustainable yield as their objective for fishing. MSY was treated as the target, the goal, rather than the upper limit to what should be caught. It's got the word sustainable in it, so it's gotta be a good policy, right? The problem was that if you were overfishing even a little bit more than the MSY, your population would start to shrink. Overfish a lot, and the population would collapse. When MSY was first adopted, it seemed impossible that such kinds of overfishing would ever be possible. Little did anyone know just how much the fishing industry was about to change. In the early days of Northwest Atlantic fishing, fish were exclusively caught in the shallow waters close to the coast. But as boats got bigger, equipment got stronger, and nets were able to be cast more deeply in the water, boats started to fish on the continental shelf, including in the waters of the Grand Banks. This marked the branching of the fishery into two distinct groups, the inshore and the offshore. The inshore fishery was mostly made up of people from rural areas who fished on their own small boats to feed their families and to make what was usually a pretty modest living. Entering the offshore fishery required more expensive boats and equipment, which meant it was less accessible to individuals and was more often engaged in by large corporations. The 1950s was the start of the fishing industry's very own industrial revolution. Boats were being equipped with mechanized hauling and baiting devices, making it faster to pull in a catch and get started on your next one. Cotton nets were being replaced with more durable nylon ones, which made it possible to use bigger nets and land more fish with a single haul. Even the way fish were found was changing. Thanks to the development of sonar, radar, and satellite navigation, it became possible to hunt down schools of fish no matter where they went. All of these increases in efficiency introduced a logistical bottleneck for the offshore fishery. Their boats were filling up faster, but they still needed to return to port once their boat was full to unload the fish for processing. This downtime traveling back and forth to port limited how much fish they could catch. The innovation that completely altered the way the offshore industry worked was the idea to put the fish processing facilities on the boats themselves. By tacking on processing facilities below deck, ships could perform transfers of processed goods on the ocean to transport ships and stay out at sea longer to maximize their profit potential for the season. These ships are known as factory trawlers. The first factory trawler to hit the ocean was the British ship the Fairtree in 1954, and this thing was a monster. Despite the Fairtree's $4.5 million annual operating cost, it had the capacity to process 600 tons of fish per day. Just to help you visualize that, that's the weight of almost 10,000 average humans being processed every day by one boat. The Fairtree was a money-making machine. Very quickly, the rest of the developed world took notice and began expanding their own offshore fleets of factory trawlers to exploit the depths of oceans around the world, and in particular, the plentiful cod stocks around Newfoundland. Now this cod is no ordinary cod. This is a graph of cod landings per year from the 2J3KL zone. Between 1900 and 1955, total reported cod landings from 2J3KL fluctuated between 100,000 and 300,000 tons per year. But between 1956 and 1968, when fleets of factory trawlers were being deployed around Newfoundland, cod landings tripled in a period of just 12 years. In 1968, they reached an all-time high of 810,000 tons in the 2J3KL area alone. That's the weight of more than 13 million people, or just under the entire population of Ontario today, taken from a single species of fish in one area of the ocean in a single year. Over 700,000 tons of this was coming just from the offshore catch, of which hardly any was Canadian cod. Canada was doing its best to develop its own factory trawler fleet, but was being outfished by larger countries who were able to expand their offshore fleets faster and were making off with insane catches from the Grand Banks. This was a big problem for Canada, not only because overfishing was beginning to catch on as a real-world concern, but also because of the economic opportunity that they were losing out to other countries on. Unsurprisingly, all of these technological advancements were coming at a cost to the environment in the North Atlantic. The nylon nets replacing cotton ones were not biodegradable anymore, so now, if a net got lost at sea in a storm, it became a floating trap that would strangle and kill anything that got caught in it. Another term used to refer to trawlers is draggers, because of the way they drag a submerged net behind their boat to catch fish. Thanks to the technological improvements in the 50s and 60s, they had developed methods of lowering their nets hundreds of feet down to the continental shelf. This extended range meant that places on the ocean floor where previously fish were out of human reach were now being sucked clean of everything like a giant Roomba. Not only were draggers able to extract almost every single fish wherever they went, but in the process, they were destroying the spawning grounds where cod were hatched and raised. These new hyper-efficient draggers were carrying out the underwater equivalent of clear-cutting a forest or strip mining a mountain everywhere they went. And it came with devastating levels of damage to the ecosystem. The problem was, this was all happening out of sight, at the bottom of the ocean. People wouldn't start noticing just how much damage was being done until far too late. With the explosion of cod landings that peaked in 1968, it was painfully clear that some amount of overexploitation was going on. But because we're talking about a resource that exists underwater and mostly out of sight, it was difficult to quantify how big the scope of this problem actually was. To get ahead of what they saw as a disaster waiting to happen, in 1970, ICNAF started recommending an upper limit on fishing in their management zones. This was known as the Total Allowable Catch, or TAC. By 1974, nearly all species fished in the ICNAF management zone had a TAC imposed, including cod. The MSY was already the intended fishing objective, so it was the natural place to set the TAC to start. No more would the MSY be a target that could be blown past without concern. The past 20 years had shown just how easy it was to completely overshoot it. Now, MSY would be the explicit ceiling on what was considered safe by fishery scientists. The imposed TACs were divided up and awarded to member nations of ICNAF. There were two problems with this. First, ICNAF's estimates for what the maximum sustainable yield should be were way too high, for reasons we'll get into a bit later. But secondly, these TACs were being divided up between member nations of ICNAF, but nations that weren't members were still fishing in the Northwest Atlantic. It was agreed on by all member nations that ICNAF would be in charge of setting quotas, but non-members hadn't agreed to those rules. International waters were fair game as far as they were concerned. From the perspective of non-member nations, the fish on the Atlantic coast of North America had been a common property resource for centuries, so why was it up to a few nations to suddenly get to change those rules? ICNAF was pretty toothless when it came to enforcement of its policies. It would be up to individual member nations to do that, and no one was willing to stop other countries from fishing on international waters. At least, not yet. So, for most of the 60s and 70s, cod was fished at a rate higher than the MSY, thanks to supercharged fishing fleets with unregulated and unrestricted access to the waters around Newfoundland. The decline in the cod population was apparent in the catch numbers. Almost every year after 1968, the catch rate in 2J3KL declined, not because of changes in management strategies, but because the fish were being taken before they could repopulate. By the mid-70s, the writing was on the wall. Overfishing was destroying the cod stocks. Every country in the Northwest Atlantic was worried about the profitability of their fishing industries if fish started disappearing in meaningful numbers. Yet still, no one was willing to reduce their fishing capacities and risk missing out if opportunistic countries would just swoop in and take what was left. So, Canada had the idea to expand their territorial borders further out into the ocean. In 1964, Canada had done this to a smaller extent. They had declared the extension of their ocean border to 12 miles, which as a fix for overfishing was a band-aid on a bullet hole. This had turned the Gulf of the St. Lawrence into an exclusive Canadian fishing zone, but did nothing to deter overfishing on the Grand Banks, where the worst of it was taking place. However, this move really upset some of Canada's international trading partners, particularly the United States. The US had a large global fishing fleet and were interested in maintaining the freedom of open seas to continue exploiting those resources. To that end, the Nixon and Ford administrations had been holding off expanding their own territorial borders for years to avoid creating a legal double standard that would end up with other countries closing their oceans to American fishing boats. But as it became clear that the global trends were shifting in that direction anyways, the US prepared for their own border expansion. In 1977, along with the US and several other coastal nations, Canada extended its coastal borders to 200 miles, creating what is called an Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ. This basically meant that Canada had claimed exclusive rights to resources in that area. This move effectively claimed most of the Grand Banks, and therefore most of the Northwest Atlantic cod stocks, to be under Canadian jurisdiction. If the tragedy of the Commons was to be avoided, the only way Canada saw out of this was to turn the Commons into a federally regulated area. At face value, this was great news for Canada and for the cod. Canada would have sole access to most of the Grand Banks, and the DFO would be responsible for setting the TAC within Canadian waters. This meant that, in theory, they could reduce the TAC to prioritize building back up the cod population, which had seen an 82% decline in the 15 years before the Exclusive Economic Zone had been established. But there were three major problems that stood in the way of this actually becoming Canada's main priority. First off, in the eyes of many, the Canadian offshore fishing fleet was actually too small. When the Exclusive Economic Zone took effect in 1977, 95% of Canadian boats were inshore boats and were too small to fish in the offshore waters. Instead of being seen as a good first step towards conservation of the fish populations, this was seen as a loss of economic opportunity by many, particularly in Newfoundland. For the past 20 years, Newfoundland had been watching the factory trawlers take, and now it was their turn to get a slice of the pie. The solution here was the creation of several joint ventures with foreign nations who would be awarded part of the TAC. The same foreign fishing boats that were just kicked out of the Exclusive Economic Zone were being let right back in, but this time they were giving Canada a portion of their catch in exchange for access to the Grand Banks. Effectively, Canada was now collecting a toll from foreign ships, and free money is always hard to turn down. The second problem getting in the way of conservation was that the federal government managed the fish resources, but the provincial governments regulated the supply chain to process them. Both levels of government often used the fishery when they could to gain political points, which frequently led to situations where the federal and provincial governments were playing bureaucratic blackmail. In 1977, the provincial government of Newfoundland began authorizing the construction of more fish processing plants than the province needed given the current TACs. They were aiming to create jobs and, by proxy, gain favor with the voters. The implied threat to Ottawa was that if Pierre Trudeau's government refused to increase the fishing quotas to supply all of the new factories, then the federal government would take the blame and bleed votes from Atlantic Canada in the next federal election. So, the federal government caved, and in the face of an ecological crisis in the Atlantic, they allowed the cod catch to continue increasing. In 1975, there were nearly 14,000 fishermen registered and employed in Newfoundland's inshore fishery. By 1980, that number had more than doubled. To avoid mass layoffs and economic hardships, the federal government continued to keep the TAC as high as possible. The final barrier to conserving the Atlantic cod stocks was the fact that there was a significant lack of understanding in how the ecosystem worked. Case in point, take a look at the capelin. Capelin are one of the main sources of food for cod, and having a healthy capelin population would be important if you're trying to grow your cod population. But countries like the USSR had realized that capelin were also great for turning into fish meal to feed their livestock. They were looking to get an allocation of the Canadian capelin quota because the capelin stock in Soviet waters had already collapsed from overfishing by the 70s. Without any concern for the impact this would have on the struggling cod population, Canada awarded the Soviets a 266,000-ton quota for capelin from 1978. The problem was that this stock was already in the process of collapsing in the Grand Banks. In 1978, the capelin didn't make an appearance in the inshore or the offshore, leaving countries with capelin quotas empty-handed and leaving the cod wondering where their next meal would come from. And if it wasn't bad enough that the cod's main source of food was disappearing, the population of one of their main predators was growing. By the middle of the 20th century, the seal hunt in eastern Canada was on the decline. Outside observers saw it as a cruel industry because young seal pups were killed and harvested for their fur. In the early 1980s, most of Europe banned the import of sealskin products from seals under a year old, further collapsing the seal hunting industry and allowing their population to recover. Now, to be clear, the decline of the sealing industry is not the cause of the collapse of northern cod. The data on this relationship is rocky. But ecosystems are complicated, and you have to expect that there would be some repercussions down the food chain if a predator population starts to grow. While it looked like the introduction of the 200-mile zone meant that conservation of the cod would be almost a solely Canadian problem, this wasn't at all the case. When the EEZ was introduced in 1977, ICNAF's management area was slashed. The only areas of interest left in their management zone were the nose and tail of the Grand Banks and the Flemish Cap. Canada tried to argue to get those areas included within their EEZ, but never got international buy-in to do so, a failure which would later come back to haunt them. It just so happened that the chunks of the Grand Banks outside of the EEZ were some of the most critical habitats for the cod, and without jurisdiction, Canada was just close enough to have a clear view of the area that was about to be pillaged. Without a strong mandate for management in the Northwest Atlantic, ICNAF collapsed in 1977. It wasn't until 2 years later in 1979 when it would be replaced by the Northwest Atlantic Fisheries Organization, or NAFO. NAFO's goal was to perform a similar function, but with a mandate restricted only to those areas outside of the 200-mile zone. In that 2-year period between the collapse of ICNAF and the formation of NAFO, there was no international body regulating fishing outside of the 200-mile zone. Opportunistic countries saw this as a fire sale and squirreled away as much as they could fill their boats with from the edges of the Grand Banks for a full 2 years. In 1980, when NAFO finally got settled and resumed setting quotas for the management zone outside of the 200-mile limit, several populations were showing dangerous signs of stress from overfishing, including cod. NAFO decided on 2 drastic measures to address this. The first was to reduce their TAC recommendations from their estimated MSY to about 60% of it to address overfishing. This level would, in theory, be able to allow for population growth year over year, but we'll get back to that point. The second action NAFO took was directed specifically at cod, which was being recognized as the most critically damaged stock in the North Atlantic. They announced a 1-year moratorium on cod fishing in the management zone, just enough time to allow the cod population to catch their breath and bounce back a bit. This announcement was met with outrage, particularly from Spain. Spain was the most involved country in the Northwest Atlantic fishery after Canada. In 1969, Spain had more than 150 vessels fishing on the Grand Banks. Between 1961 and 1972, Spain's take of cod from the Grand Banks was more than 200,000 tons per year. But after 1977, Spain had been cut off from the watering hole. In 1979, Canada had only permitted 4 Spanish trawlers within the 200-mile zone, and Spain was not happy about it. So, when NAFO announced the Cod Moratorium in 1980, Spain essentially told them to shove it. Since they weren't a NAFO member at the time, they argued the rules didn't apply to them, and they kept their entire fleet fishing on the edge of the Grand Banks and the Flemish Cap. It was only after Ottawa threatened to ban all Spanish ships from Canadian ports that the Spanish finally backed their fleet away. But Spain didn't stop there. Practically overnight, a new fleet of ships had arrived, bearing a stunning resemblance to the Spanish fleet that had just left, but with flags of South American, non-NAFO member states. These weren't actually South American ships, of course. The Spanish had just changed the flags on their ships to claim they weren't the ones fishing there. These guys were going to take what they wanted, and they didn't give a damn about what Canada, or anyone else for that matter, had to say about it. As foreign and local overfishing continued into the early 80s, Ottawa was getting concerned about the possible financial collapse of the fishing industry and the political turmoil that it would cause in Atlantic Canada. But the concern for the collapse of the ocean ecosystem was little more than an afterthought. In 1982, Prime Minister Trudeau appointed a task force headed by Deputy Clerk Michael Kirby to look long and hard at the economics of the fishery. Kirby, a mathematician turned civil servant, determined that there were 3 main financial problems with how the fishery was being run. Overly generous subsidies and growth in the industry after the EEZ was established in 1977, a lack of focus on creating high-quality final products, and a pervasive attitude within the industry to resist adapting to change. But overall, somehow Kirby determined that overfishing was not an existential detriment to the industry. The Kirby report released at the end of 1982 stated that although the industry has many problems, a shortage of fish is not one of them. Just 10 years after that report, the Northern Atlantic cod had been fished to near extinction. Let's talk a little bit about the DFO. Like many of Canada's federal departments, the Prime Minister appoints one of his MPs to oversee the department. The Minister of Fisheries and Oceans is advised by scientists within the DFO and takes their recommendations into account when making policy decisions related to the fisheries and the oceans. Pierre Trudeau resigned as Prime Minister in June of 1984. The Liberals were defeated by Brian Mulroney's Progressive Conservative Party in the election later that year. Over the course of his 9 years as Prime Minister, Mulroney would come to appoint 4 different MPs to the position of Minister of Fisheries and Oceans. Let's call them the 4 seahorsemen of the codpocalypse. These 4 ministers were responsible for overseeing the well-being of the Canadian cod fishery, and under their watches, an entire industry would collapse. Mulroney's first Minister of Fisheries and Oceans was John Fraser, and to be honest, he didn't really have much of an impact on the collapse of the cod fishery during his tenure at the DFO. However, John Fraser's story is an important anecdote that helps to set the tone for the Mulroney government's approach to handling advice from subject matter experts. It didn't take long for Fraser to be caught up in a scandal that became known as Tunagate. A processing plant in New Brunswick had been packaging tuna that had gone very, very bad and was declared unfit for human consumption by health regulators. Instead of throwing out the bad fish, which the processing company claimed would require them to lay off their entire processing plant, this company lobbied Minister Fraser to help them bypass the health inspector's ruling. Fraser obliged, which resulted in about 1 million cans of this tainted tuna to end up in grocery stores around the country. CBC broke the story on the Fifth Estate in the fall of 1985, which quickly led to the resignation of Minister Fraser from his appointment at the DFO. You'd think he would have faced some serious punishment for bypassing regulatory health and safety protocols, but this was basically a slap on the wrist for Fraser. Not only did he stay on as an MP in Mulroney's government, he was later elected as Speaker of the House of Commons, one of the highest ranking positions in the country. Talk about failing upwards. The Tunagate scandal feels very representative for the environment within the Mulroney government and the DFO. Advice from scientific experts was often overlooked or rejected if it didn't fit with the management objectives of the federal government.
The day that experts think that they are right all the time is the day when you've got the tyranny of the expert. And in this department, there's not going to be any tyranny of experts or officials.
Fraser was soon replaced as Minister of Fisheries and Oceans by Tom Siddon, Seahorseman No. 2. Siddon was promoted to this position hot off the press from his stint as Secretary of State for Science and Technology. In just over a year, he had laid the foundation of the Canadian Space Agency and signed the International Space Station Agreement with the United States. Siddon was stepping into one of the rockiest industries in the country, but his background in science leadership gave some hope that the DFO would be making their policy decisions based on data from the fishery, not just data from the economy. But Siddon was inheriting a complex political situation on the Grand Banks. In 1986, Spain and Portugal officially joined the European Community, the precursor to the modern European Union. Because all the other members of the EC were very aware of Spain and Portugal's tendencies to completely overfish wherever they went, a condition on them joining the EC was that they were barred from fishing in European waters for the first 10 years of their membership. So naturally, the Spanish and Portuguese wanted to expand their fleets into foreign waters, and where better to pillage the ocean's resources than the Grand Banks? The EC was represented as a single contracting party within NAFO, which starting in 1986 had to also represent the interests of Spain and Portugal. So, the EC asked NAFO to raise its quotas from 60% of the MSY back up to the 100% they used to recommend. NAFO refused. Since compliance with NAFO policies is completely voluntary and not really enforceable, the EC opted out of the NAFO conservation policies and unilaterally set their own quotas starting in 1986. For cod, they regularly set their quota at 5 times higher than what NAFO split amongst all its members, or in other terms, they were taking 300% of the MSY all for themselves. The fish pirates were now in charge on the high seas of the Grand Banks. But overfishing on the Grand Banks was not exclusively an issue of foreign overfishing. Expansion of the Canadian cod fishery since 1977 had resulted in a boom of overfishing in both the inshore and offshore. By the mid-80s, fishermen in the inshore were starting to see signs that the cod didn't look like they should. The fish they were catching were smaller than they used to be, sometimes only half as big on average, and were looking less healthy. These were signs of a stressed population. The cod stocks were in freefall. 1986 became a busy year for researchers trying to understand exactly what was going on. 3 important reports were developed in that year. The first report was published by Drs. Derek Keats, Don Steele, and John Green, biologists from Memorial University in St. John's. The Keats report came to 2 main conclusions. The first was that there appeared to be a connection between the massive offshore landings taken by factory trawlers and the poor stock conditions developing in the inshore. This wasn't a scientifically accepted perspective at the time, but the inshore fishermen had been saying this to the government for years, almost always falling on deaf ears. The second conclusion was that the DFO had significantly overestimated the 1986 cod population and therefore set much too high of a TAC. However, the most damning part of the Keats report was that all of these conclusions were reached with the DFO's own data. This essentially confirmed that the DFO was burying its head in the sand in the face of an economically inconvenient truth. The Atlantic cod were being aggressively overfished. The second cod report in 1986 was by Dr. George Winters, head of the Pelagic Fish, Shellfish, and Marine Mammals Division of the DFO in Newfoundland. Although Winters was a member of the DFO, he was not a fan of his own department's cod assessment, and he made that abundantly clear. The name of his paper was Aide-Memoire on 2J3KL Assessment, Non Gratum Anus Rodentum. Translated from Latin to English, that subtitle reads, Wasn't Worth a Rat's Ass. Winters concluded that the woes being experienced in the inshore were due to overfishing and high TAC levels recommended on the back of bad scientific advice from within the DFO. Winters commented on the department's report for the 2J3KL cod assessment, saying, not only is its train of thought inconsistent, but quite often there are no passengers on it. Winters' report was one of the first times someone within the DFO suggested that their own department was getting things wrong with their estimates on the cod population and the TAC. A third report for 1986 was done by the Canadian Atlantic Fisheries Scientific Advisory Committee, or CAFSAC, the organization who provides scientific advice on fish stocks to the DFO. In 1986, CAFSAC produced a report called Advisory Document 86/25, and this report was a mess riddled with self-inconsistencies. It projected that the northern cod biomass would continue to increase after 1987, while at the same time presenting data that showed for the past 9 years the TAC had been set twice as high as it should have been. To those paying attention, it was clear that there had been a huge amount of unquantified uncertainty on the cod population, and that the estimates had been further off than they thought they possibly could be. In 1 year, 3 reports by 3 different agencies showed that there were systemic issues in recent management of the cod fishery that had resulted in years of overfishing. The first 2 reports were highly critical of the DFO's assessments and methodologies. CAFSAC's report was not so much, largely because they were partially responsible for giving a lot of the advice to the DFO over the past decade that was now being scrutinized. The 3 reports from 1986 all showed that the TAC was being set too high because the fish population was being estimated incorrectly. So why was this happening? Well, figuring out how many fish there are in the ocean is not an easy nor cheap question to answer. The department of the DFO in Newfoundland dedicated just to Atlantic cod consisted of less than 10 people. 150,000 square kilometers is a lot of ocean to cover with so few people. Nevertheless, they did their best to come up with estimates for the population through modeling, but models can only get you so far. As the saying goes, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. In an effort to make their model more useful, they wanted to tune these estimates to real-world data. This is where things get kind of wild. Specifically, they would look at catch data from offshore trawlers and use that data to adjust their estimates. Offshore trawlers were equipped with technology to hunt down schools of fish, no matter how many or how few were present in the ocean. Because of this, they were almost always able to catch a full haul, so estimates made by the DFO on this data made it seem like the population was as healthy as could be. This may sound like a ridiculous way to tune your estimates, and it kind of is, But like I said before, estimating a population that lives hundreds of feet below the ocean is not an easy task. At the time, this was the best way they had of adjusting their models and making an educated guess. As a side note, in retrospect, a lot of people later asked why the DFO only used data from offshore boats rather than include data from the inshore catches. The answer mostly lies in the fact that there were less than 10 employees in the DFO allocated to studying cod. It was a lot less time-consuming to collect data from large companies who could provide standardized data from 50 trawlers in a single delivery than it was to set up a system where individual inshore boats reported data in a standardized way. So, in general, estimates for the cod populations came with some hefty error bars. Even using the most sophisticated modeling and sampling techniques for the era, the margin of error on these estimates were often in the range of 50% and sometimes higher. This meant that if the population was estimated to be 1 million tons, the population could actually be anywhere from 1.5 million tons to just 500,000. But when recommendations got fed up through the chain of command at the DFO, nuance on things like ambiguity and error bars in the data weren't often reflected in the final report. If you stuck to the middle of the range, you would be okay more often than not, but it also meant that sometimes you would be way off. Based on some fishery modeling from within the DFO, Canada's domestic policy for setting the cod TAC was to peg it at about 18% of the population per year. This was a relatively arbitrary level, but it was below the MSY and deemed to be a safe target to fish at. If the population was estimated at 1 million tons, that would turn into a TAC recommendation of 180,000 tons. But if your population happened to be on the low end of the error bars, suddenly you would be fishing 36% of the population in a single year, and the DFO had no way of knowing that they were fishing well above their target rate. In the 70s and 80s, this had been happening year over year. At the time they were released, the Keats Report, the Winters Report, and CAFSAC's advisory document were not treated very seriously by senior management within the DFO. Many DFO scientists didn't even know these reports existed. It wasn't so much these three reports that led Tom Siddon to act on the cod issue as it was pressure from inshore fishermen groups. The cod were not showing up in the inshore in the same numbers as they used to, and fishers were getting worried. So, with three reports on his desk that confirmed that offshore fishing was likely the cause of the issues in the inshore, Tom Siddon took action. And by action, I actually mean he commissioned another study to assess the issue. For real. It's like 3 firefighters in the entire neighborhood just told the DFO that the pot of water they left on the stove was still boiling, and rather than go turn the heat down or off, they wanted a 4th firefighter to give their opinion about it, just to make sure they weren't being too hasty. So in August of 1987, Tom Siddon appointed a commission of independent marine scientists, headed by Dr. Dayton Lee Alverson. Alverson's report was submitted in November of that year, and confirmed everything that the 3 reports from the year prior were saying. The DFO had been overestimating the cod population and had gotten the TAC tragically wrong for more than a decade. Alverson was also blunt about who was responsible for the blame. You have to blame it on the government, who have been reticent to make effective and timely decisions. We're looking at you there, Tom. As an absolute minimum response to the crisis at hand, Alverson recommended that the TAC for 1988 be fixed at the 1987 level of 256,000 tons, or even lower if possible. With a metaphorical slap in the face, Tom Siddon set it at 266,000 tons. Yet again, the government opted to delay a meaningful decision, and yet again, concerns for the cod had fallen on deaf ears. By 1988, the DFO scientists had known for more or less 2 years that they had been overestimating the cod population by about 50%. They tried to correct for this with their recommendation for the 1989 TAC. The official recommendation made to Tom Siddon was that the TAC should be set at 125,000 tons, assuming it was still the DFO's goal to be fishing at the safe level of 18% of the population. This really put Tom Siddon in a bind. In 1988, the inshore alone received a 125,000 ton allocation. With this recommendation from the DFO, this would mean that if Siddon gave the full 125,000 tons to the inshore, it would effectively close the offshore fishery for the entire year. No matter what, people were gonna lose their jobs. Usually the TAC for the coming year is announced by the DFO just before Christmas. In 1988, the DFO stalled until December 30th, when Tom Siddon finally announced a provisional TAC of 266,000 tons. What he meant by provisional was that this was a placeholder, because he was going to have to lower this even further, but was waiting on the most current scientific information to do so. When it finally came in, advice from the DFO scientists ranged from the 125,000 tons initially proposed, which corresponded to fishing about 20% of the population. On the upper end of the advice was 233,000 tons, which was closer to 40% of the population. Now here, the scientists made it clear, 125,000 tons was the safe level to fish at for the cod to maintain their current level. Any more than that would cause damage and deplete their numbers. But Siddon had his own priorities. In February in St. John's, Tom Siddon announced that the 1989 TAC would be set at 235,000 tons. Tom Siddon had yet again ignored the TAC recommendation put forward by the scientists, opting to put the short-term economic concerns of the fishery before the long-term ecological and economic disaster that they were heading head first into. As small as the cut to the TAC was from the previous year, its impact in Newfoundland was predictably huge. The offshore fishery absorbed most of the cut, which led to the closing of 2 fish plants and a dozen trawlers were shored for the season. Atlantic Canada was becoming heavily concerned with how the federal government had been managing the fishery, and rightfully so. Whether it was a genuine desire for more information on the crisis at hand or another stall tactic, the federal government formed yet another committee to assess the cod. This one was chaired by a well-respected historian and the president of Memorial University in Newfoundland, Dr. Leslie Harris. Tom Siddon wanted a report as soon as possible that could help the DFO determine what the TAC would be for 1990, so by May, Harris had produced an interim report. It was not what Siddon wanted to hear at all. Harris was recommending a reduction of the TAC to 190,000 tons for 1990. In classic Tom Siddon fashion, he pegged the TAC for 1990 just above the recommendation, at 197,000 tons. Because, of course. The final Harris report was released on February 19, 1990, and it spawned quite the discussion in the House of Commons that day. Newfoundland MP George Baker had a few questions for Tom Siddon. Particularly, he wanted to know what the government was doing about the fact that offshore trawlers were consistently fishing in spawning areas and disrupting the cod from reproducing.
Mr. Speaker, today the long-awaited Harris report on the northern cod stock was delivered to the Minister of Fisheries. Today the northern cod stock is involved in that very delicate pre-spawning activity that is so vital for the actual spawning itself. And I want to ask the Minister of Fisheries, will the Government of Canada now take the advice of these experienced fishermen and cancel the licenses of every foreign trawler licensed by this government inside of our 200-mile zone for 1990?
Mr. Speaker, scientists advise me that there is no recorded evidence in the scientific literature or our own research that fishing on the spawning grounds does measurable damage to the cod stocks.
Now today he's telling us that according to his advice, that the disruption of the spawning ground has nothing to do with the spawning process. According to his advice, Mr. Speaker, he must be getting his advice from a Ouija board. If you disrupt the spawning grounds, a codfish will not spawn. How would the minister like it if he had a Soviet trawler barging through his bedroom? Cancel the licenses.
The honourable member is obviously a great expert on spawning, although I don't know how much he knows about bedrooms.
And whoever said politics was boring? The thing is, what Tom Siddon said was technically true. There was no recorded evidence, either by the DFO itself or in broader academic research, which showed that fishing on the spawning grounds did measurable damage to cod stocks. But the only reason that was true was because at the time, no one had ever done any research into it. What a misleading way to present that information. What other species do we as humans hunt and kill while they are in the process of reproduction? It's common sense. If we let them breed, there will be more to hunt later. But no one in the offshore fishery or the federal government apparently, was thinking that way about the cod. Since 1990, studies have been carried out to assess this, and surprise, surprise, bottom trawling tends to have negative impacts on the birth rates of fish in those areas. Who would have thunk it? Surely not Tom. Shortly after Harris released his final report, Tom Siddon took his bow at the DFO and was replaced as Minister of Fisheries and Oceans by Seahorseman III, Bernard Valcour. Valcour had previously served as a cabinet minister for Mulroney until 1989, when he was forced to resign from cabinet after drunk driving on a motorcycle and getting into an accident that cost him an eye. Yet just 7 months later, he was reappointed to cabinet as Minister of Fisheries and Oceans. His appointment was controversial for obvious reasons, and really makes you wonder what Mulroney was thinking. One of Valcour's first acts as Minister of the DFO was the announcement of the Atlantic Fisheries Adjustment Program. This was an aid package that would spend $584 million over 5 years to provide short-term relief to those laid off by plant closures and to help invest in bringing back decimated fish stocks. The total value of all landed cod in Newfoundland in 1990 was only $134 million. Government aid was almost as high as the profits on the cod itself. This was no longer an economically sustainable industry. The final Harris report made 29 recommendations to the federal government that should be undertaken immediately to address the crisis in the Atlantic fishery. The most important in the bunch was a further reduction in the TAC for 1990 and onwards. Of the 29 recommendations, Valcour accepted 26. Lowering the TAC was one of the 3 rejected. From his perspective, the social and economic consequences of lowering the TAC were simply too dire. Come on! The federal government was now 5 scientific reports deep, all agreeing that there was a problem. They now had concrete, scientifically backed advice for how to stop the bleeding, and they still couldn't bring themselves to act. Valcour's rejection of a TAC reduction for 1990 is considered by some to be the worst decision ever made by a federal fisheries minister. At the end of 1990, unwilling to further strain the Atlantic economy, Valcour set the 1991 TAC at 190,000 tons. The thing is, by this point, it didn't matter. The crisis had reached Newfoundland's doorstep. The TAC was set for 190,000 tons, but for all the fishing effort and technologically sophisticated boats, the fishermen caught less than 70% of that. There just weren't enough fish. Newfoundland was on a collision course with the reality of the ocean, and they were going to need a captain willing to go down with the sinking ship. In many ways, John Crosbie was the perfect man for the job when it came to the crisis in Atlantic Canada. Crosbie previously held the position of Provincial Minister of Fisheries in Newfoundland before running for federal government, and came from a long line of prominent business leaders from the province. His grandfather was briefly Prime Minister of Newfoundland before they joined Canada. And although his father was a staunch critic of Newfoundland joining Canada, John Crosbie himself was a pillar of leadership for Atlantic Canada as a Member of Parliament in Ottawa. On April 21st of 1991, Mulroney shuffled his cabinet and John Crosbie ended up with the job of Federal Minister of Fisheries. It was time for a Newfoundlander to take the wheel. Minister of Fisheries and Oceans was Crosbie's nightmare job, but for him it was also the most important job he could hold to help stop the bleeding back home. One of Crosbie's first priorities as Minister of Fisheries and Oceans was to deal with foreign overfishing happening on the Grand Banks. For the past few years, Canada had been preparing, albeit extremely slowly, to rein in their own TAC. At the same time, overfishing on the Grand Banks had been getting worse, and the European community was at the center of it. As a collective bloc of powerful nations, the European community was of the opinion that the collapsing Atlantic cod population was squarely Canada's problem, not theirs. In 1990, NAFO had set a cod TAC of just over 15,000 tons on the nose and tail of the Grand Banks. The European community set their own unilateral quota of 60,000 tons. Spain and Portugal didn't care at all about either quota. Spain alone caught 62,000 tons in 1990, and Portugal caught 32,000. Diplomats from Canada were practically begging these countries to stop overfishing and help save the Grand Banks, but countries like Spain and Portugal were spitting in their faces. As I'm pretty sure the old song goes, Spain's disdain fell mainly on Canada's strain and pain, and cared mainly what they could obtain from the remains of the Grand Banks gravy train. How insane. The mood in Newfoundland was sour. A processing plant in Trepassey shut down in September of 1991 due to a lack of fish. 640 people were laid off, representing $14 million in annual wages to a rural community with no other real job prospects. The reality of the declining fishery was becoming painfully clear. While the DFO was getting their fair share of the blame, local frustrations were intensifying towards foreign overfishing on the Grand Banks. Newspapers in St. John's were calling for gunboat diplomacy to deal with the Spanish and Portuguese, which Canadian leaders were quick to dismiss. As the federal government continued attempting to convince the European community to stop overfishing, Crosby was faced with setting the TAC for 1992. Even though the total catch for 1991 was well below the TAC of 190,000 tons, John Crosby decided to set the TAC for 1992 to just 5,000 tons below the previous year, which he said was based on the advice given to him by DFO scientists. In February, CAFSAC provided a devastating update that estimated that the entire cod population currently sat at 130,000 tons and recommended the TAC be lowered to 25,000 tons. John Crosby adjusted the TAC for the year to 120,000 tons, which would have left only 10,000 tons in the population for next year. It appeared as though everyone was sleepwalking off a cliff and praying for a miracle, but no such miracle was coming. By June, the European community had finally agreed to stop fishing cod on the nose and tail of the Grand Banks. Everyone knew what this actually meant was that their boats weren't catching enough fish to justify sticking around. Rumors that the fishery would have to close were on everyone's mind in Newfoundland that summer. When Newfoundland MP Brian Tobin accosted John Crosby in the House of Commons on June 22nd, Crosby put on his best poker face and tried to make it seem like everything was fine. But on June 30th, the news broke that the worst was coming true. In 2 days, Ottawa would be formally announcing a ban on fishing for cod. The day after the news broke just so happened to be Canada Day, and John Crosby had been invited to Bay Bulls to celebrate there with his family. But what was supposed to be a party quickly turned into a protest. Crosby was hounded by locals who wanted details about the closure of the fishery. How were they going to pay their bills now? How long would the ban be for? And why did the government wait so long to act? Entire communities were on the brink of losing their jobs and their way of life, and no one knew what would come next. They were scared and they were mad. But Crosby didn't think that he deserved all the blame and wasn't afraid to speak his mind about it.
I didn't take the fish from the goddamn water.
But who took it? You and your goddamn people took it! You and your people!
On July 2nd, Crosby held a press conference in a hotel in St. John's to officially announce that the 2J3KL cod fishery was cancelled for the rest of the year, and that a 2-year moratorium would take place to give the population a chance to rebuild. The news wasn't a surprise by that point, but that didn't make it hurt any less. The details of the emergency aid package that would be coming into effect for those laid off by the closure of the fishery was also announced. The federal government was promising a mere $225 per week, or about $1 more than full-time minimum wage. Most fishermen took this as a slap in the face from their government who mismanaged the cod into extinction. They decided they were not going to take this lying down. Several fishermen stormed the lobby of the hotel where the press conference was taking place and attempted to kick the doors down to have a word with their Minister of Fisheries and Oceans during the middle of his press conference. No one in the federal government was surprised that the news of the moratorium was met poorly, but the violence on display was something that they had not anticipated. Newfoundland Premier Clyde Wells wrote a letter to Brian Mulroney that week, explaining that their reaction to the announcement does not come from selfishness or ingratitude. Rather, it stems from disbelief that their country and their government, having in 40 years so managed the fish stock from which they and their ancestors derived their living for 400 years, as to require that they be prohibited from fishing it in the immediate future, could even for an interim period offer compensation that for many is less than welfare. The long-term plan was put together and announced by the federal government 2 weeks later, which as far as bailouts go was pretty quick. The Northern Cod Adjustment and Rehabilitation Program aimed to retrain workers from the fishery into new industries, to give fishers and plant workers a chance to build a new career. Under the terms of what became known as the package, if you agreed to the retraining programs, you could earn up to $406 per week, and if you didn't, you were stuck with the initial offer of $225. But for many, retraining wasn't seen as a real option. What good was retraining if there were no jobs in the province in those fields? What good was retraining if you were 50 years old, past your prime working years, and had spent your entire life building skills on a fishing boat? Who would want to hire you? What started as a 2-year moratorium on cod in just the 2J3KL zone was expanded to the entire Northwest Atlantic in 1993, and extended indefinitely beyond the initial 2-year proposal. The ban on commercial cod fishing is still in effect today in 2023. NCARP was replaced by the Atlantic Groundfish Strategy in 1994 and supported tens of thousands of unemployed workers until it ran out of funds in 1998. Between the 3 biggest aid packages, the federal government spent about $3 billion on bailouts for the Atlantic fishery in the 1990s, or somewhere between $5 and $6 billion today. Between 30 and 40,000 Newfoundlanders lost their jobs with the collapse of the cod industry, or about 12% of the province's labor force. Some found employment in smaller fisheries like shellfish, others pivoted into tourism. But a lot of people didn't. In the 10 years following the moratorium, the province's population dropped by a record 10% due to outmigration. Still today, Newfoundland's population is smaller than it was at its peak in 1992. John Crosbie decided not to run for re-election in 1993 and retired from federal politics. For all the blame that he and the federal government bear for their role in the cod collapse, some credit is due as well. Crosbie's job was not an easy one, and he always believed he was acting in the interests of the working people of Newfoundland. He didn't shy away from the job or the people he represented when the sky came falling down. He remained accountable to his constituents, even when they hated his guts. In his retirement, John Crosbie once said that only one thing could have been worse than holding the job of federal fisheries minister in 1992, and that was not holding the job. The scars of the cod collapse may no longer be fresh, but they are still visible throughout Atlantic Canada and felt most strongly within Newfoundland. Newfoundland and Labrador almost always holds the highest unemployment rate in the country. Because of this, many young Newfoundlanders move away from home and out of province to chase opportunity that just doesn't exist anymore on the island. Many try to return home if they can, but for too many young professionals, it is just not feasible. This has created a gap in the labor force in Newfoundland today, particularly in rural areas. There are fewer doctors, fewer electricians, fewer plumbers, fewer everything. Schools that used to house more than 100 children now have fewer than 5. Many of the people that did stay after the moratorium are now retiring, and with a lack of services near them, they are being forced to face the idea of relocating away from their communities that they've called home for their entire lives. Since the year 2000, 8 towns in Newfoundland have voted to leave their homes and resettle in larger communities. The ripples created by the moratorium continue to permeate all aspects of island life even 30 years later. In his final report, Dr. Leslie Harris wrote that, because the technology we control gives us the power to be utterly destructive, we must be all the more aware of the heavy moral responsibilities we bear. The cod collapse was a human-made disaster, and the moral responsibility lies with us to help avoid this kind of disaster from ever happening again. In many ways, this is where the story ends. The cod fishery collapsed, the curtain closed on 5 centuries of history, and it appeared as though that was that. But the fallout from the collapse of the cod fishery created ripples that permeated through Canadian politics and world affairs, leading to one of the most surprising modern conflicts in Canadian history. In 1995, 3 years after the cod moratorium was announced, the Grand Banks had become the stage for an international conflict between Canada and one of its closest allies. The Spanish Navy had begun building up a presence of warships outside of Canada's borders, and it appeared that the unthinkable may happen. Canada was on a warpath with Spain, and it was all over an argument about one ugly fish.